I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Heather Benway. I'm the Executive Officer of the Ocean Carbon and Biogeochemistry, or OCB Project Office. I'd like to introduce today's webinar co-hosts, Gyami Shrestha, Director of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program, Libby Larson, Coordinator of the North American Carbon Program, Jinping Hu from Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi is one of our OCB SSC members. May Mahegan, OCB Communications Officer, and Mary Zawoski, OCB Administrative Associate. As you may have heard, OCB is partnering with the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program and the North American Carbon Program on this joint mini-series webinars focused on extreme events in the carbon cycle. We wanted to add a little drama to your lives. So today's talks are going to be on wildfires, and then there will be another set of talks on March 9th that will be focused on tropical storms. These webinars were intentionally scheduled to precede the virtual 7th North American Carbon Program Open Science Meeting, which is scheduled for Friday afternoons in March. I've included the banner for this below so that you can see it. The website here is listed in dark blue, so you can go, and I'll also put this in the chat. You can go and register. It's free to all. I really encourage you to check out the diverse body of scientists and stakeholders who are contributing to the meeting. This is a really well thought out agenda. And these webinars are actually meant to set the stage for an extreme events breakout session during this NACP meeting on the afternoon of March 19th that will bring interested scientists and stakeholders together to plan future research and develop new collaborations. So we hope you'll all consider participating. I want to invite my collaborators, Gyami from the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program and Libby from the North American Carbon Program, to share just a little bit about their programs before we get started.
So this is Libby. I think that Gyami is for some reason not able to join us right at this moment. So I will just very briefly talk about the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program for her. She has been the director for a fair number of years now, and the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program works under the aegis of the United States Global Change Research Program. And that GCRP has many different interagency working groups, of which the Carbon Cycle Science Program has the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group. So Gyami is the director, and she liaises directly with this interagency federal group, and we do lots of different activities in terms of funding research, but also engaging with the scientific community and producing reports, having science groups, workshops, and meetings. The most recent one that you might be familiar with is the Second State of the Carbon Cycle Report, or SOCR 2. And then there's also the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Plan from 2011. And the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program works in partnership and helps represent the U.S. in international partnerships, for example, with the Global Carbon Project, which is part of Future Earth, and with CarboNA, which is coordination at the U.S., Mexican, and Canadian government level. And I hope that I covered everything that Gyami would have wanted to say. And next we can move on to the next slide. Yes, so the North American Carbon Program is actually a primary activity of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program. And what I forgot to mention on the prior slide is that you can see the banners down here at the bottom with all of the various agency logos and program logos that are currently participating in the CCIWG. And NACP is, therefore multi-agency and multidisciplinary that is focused on carbon sources and sinks in North America and adjacent oceans. We have about 2,600 people on our email distribution list that have participated in various ways. We've been around since about 2002, and we have an implementation plan that was started in 2005. We are shortly going to be publishing an update to that. And we really have a mix of terrestrial, oceanic, atmospheric, other aquatic, human components of the carbon cycle that use researchers that use observational, experimental, and various modeling efforts. And there's my contact information. You can follow us on Twitter. And I want to thank Heather once again for helping us. We've been trying to, develop some more cross-program activities, and we're very excited about the meeting coming up next month and having these 2 webinars this week, and the next one I believe is in March. Will really help, I think, set the stage for some fabulous discussion in that breakout group. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Libby. And thank you for covering the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program slide. So much of OCB science sits at the nexus of marine ecosystems, biogeochemical cycling, and climate. These green icons here on the right depict our overarching science areas, and you can find more specific research questions on our website. I'd like to acknowledge the sustained support of NSF Chemical and Biological Oceanography and the NASA Ocean Biology and Biogeochemistry programs for making the OCB program possible for all these years, and also the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution for hosting our project office and many of our meetings and activities. We invite you to engage with OCB Network in the many ways listed here, website, social media. You can reach us by email here and follow us on Twitter. And I definitely encourage you to subscribe to the Ocean Carbon Exchange, which is a biweekly e-newsletter. And you can do that right from the front page of our website, just at the very bottom. All of these webinar talks are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel, and these special joint webinars will also be shared via NACP and U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program communication channels. So definitely, if you couldn't make it or if you have technical difficulties, not to worry. We're recording and it will be available. If you wish to submit an abstract to give an OCB webinar in the future, we'll also post that link in the chat. We are always looking for speakers for the seminar series. Here's a quick screenshot of the WebEx panel with key features already highlighted for you. Please note that all attendees are muted with video off just to reduce background noise and distraction. On the bottom right, you can see this little speech bubble. This is the chat icon. And then you can find the Q&A, which is within this little ... So if you click on the ... it should bring up a panel that will show you where the Q&A is. So you can use that when entering questions. We encourage you to use the Q&A, but if you are finding that you're only able to use the chat, just try to make sure that you select everyone as the recipient so that we can see the questions. The theme of today's webinar is wildfire impacts on carbon cycling and marine ecosystems. Today's speakers are Sasha Kramer from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Matthew Jones from the University of East Anglia in the UK. The speakers for this Extreme Events mini-series span multiple time zones, so the local times for some of our speakers are really intrusive and do not lend themselves to additional informal Q&A after the webinar, but we'll get back to offering them soon. We do really encourage you to attend the NACP meeting and the Extreme Events breakout session to continue these discussions of these topics. Now I'm going to hand it off to Jinping to introduce our first speaker, Sasha.
Great, thanks, Heather. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Sasha Kramer. Sasha is the PhD candidate at UC Santa Barbara. She's working with Dave Siegel, and her research aims to characterize global surface ocean phytoplankton community composition using a variety of in situ and remote sensing methods. And before her PhD, Sasha got her undergrad degree in Earth and Oceanographic Science from Bowdoin College. And when she's not working on her dissertation, she tries to spend as much time as possible outside and running, biking, hiking, and swimming. And also she likes to cook and she likes to bake. Without further ado, Sasha, please take it away.
Awesome, thank you so much for that introduction, Jinping. And thank you so much to OCB for having me to speak today. So I'm going to be talking about phytoplankton community composition in the Santa Barbara Channel during the Thomas Fire. And before I get too much into it, I just want to thank my amazing co-authors, Kelsey and Alexis, who have also contributed so much to this project, and I could not have done any of it without them. I wanted to give a bit of overview of my talk. I'll start with some background, talking about why a group of graduate students were on a research vessel in the Santa Barbara Channel during the Thomas Fire in the first place. I'll describe our methods a bit, talking about how we adapted our sampling to the fire conditions and what exactly we measured. And then I'll share some of our results, targeting the specific question of how did the Thomas Fire impact surface ocean phytoplankton community composition? And then finally, I want to take a moment to consider some of the implications of this work and other work like it for what it means about future California wildfires and their impacts on coastal marine ecosystems. So this research cruise started as a project called Across the Channel Investigating Dale Dynamics, or the ACID project. A group of graduate students leading our own research cruise. We wanted to have a catchy name, and we also were able to provoke our advisors a little bit by telling them we were going on our ACID cruise. But this was funded through the UC Ship Funds program and awarded us 1 week on board the RV Sally ride in December 2017. We decided to go to the Santa Barbara Channel in part because it was right in our backyard as UCSB graduate students, but also because it's a really dynamic and interesting place to study. It's one of the most productive ecosystems in the world. And I'm showing on the map here the location of the Santa Barbara Channel in relation to the state of California. But there are also a lot of historical sampling programs that have taken place in the Santa Barbara Channel on different long time scales, including the Santa Barbara Channel LTER, Cal Coffee, and SCOOS. And so these are things that are monitoring on monthly to quarterly timescales. And one that I'll talk more about in this presentation is Plumes and Blooms, or P&B, which is a monthly bio-optical transect sampling in the Santa Barbara Channel. Plumes and Blooms Station 4, which is highlighted here with a yellow star, is right in the center of the channel, and it's the only of the 7 Plumes and Blooms stations that really depth resolved sampling. So we chose that as part of this project to be our reset station every day, and followed a set of surface drifters to do a semi-Lagrangian sampling strategy over the course of the week, where we reset every morning and sampled for 24 hours in the same water mass. Now again, because we were a group of graduate students planning our own research cruise, we felt a lot of pressure to plan for the year ahead. And the cruise was in December 2017. We were planning all of our sampling and our plans for every moment of the time we were out there for over a year ahead of that. And during the whole time that we were planning, our advisors and other mentors were telling us, you're not planning so that you have a plan to follow. I'm highlighting here a great quote from Dave Valentine, who's a professor at UCSB, who kept telling us, plan so you have something to deviate from. And sure enough, we needed to have a plan to deviate from. So I'm showing here an image of the Thomas Fire when it ignited in Ventura County in the mountains right near Santa Barbara. If you weren't in Southern California at the time, you maybe still saw some of this coverage of the fire as it ignited. It was a very fast-moving and dramatic event when it first started in early December. So there was a lot of speculation about what was going to happen and how it was moving so quickly and destructively. I'm showing here a satellite image so you can get a sense of the scope and scale of the fire. It wasn't the only fire that happened at the time, but it started on December 4th, 2017, and pretty quickly these persistent offshore winds were both moving the fire along the coast and also pushing the ash and smoke offshore. So you can see right here the Santa Barbara Channel, and this plume of smoke and ash from the fire is coming right over the water. Our plan was to leave port on December 15th, and by that date, the fire had moved into Santa Barbara County. It was almost 260,000 acres, and it was less than 40% contained. So the days leading up to mobilization and leaving for this research cruise were pretty hectic and harrowing for some members of our groups. We were getting text and call alerts to evacuate at various times. The conditions on the ground were pretty intense, but we all felt very motivated to take advantage of this opportunity and use it as a way to look at some of the potential impacts of the fire on the ocean ecosystem. So we adjusted some of our sampling to specifically ask this question: how did the Thomas Fire impact surface ocean phytoplankton community composition? We hypothesized that this could potentially impact the phytoplankton community in one of two ways. either by the smoke and ash limiting the light that could reach the surface ocean, or potentially by ash that was reaching the surface ocean and dissolving, adding a source of nutrients. We also considered that both of these factors could be at play at the same time and wondered how the interplay might ultimately work. So we were able to test all of this by quantifying and describing the phytoplankton community composition during the fire. And then ultimately after our cruise, we were able to compare our results to the historical sampling that has been done in the Santa Barbara Channel to see how similar or different December 2017 was to other Decembers in the Santa Barbara Channel. So a brief overview of the methods that I'll talk about today. Again, we had a large group of graduate students and faculty members on this cruise, so we were taking a lot of different types of samples, and other group members could talk more expansively about their work. But today I'm going to be showing two specific results. So one is taking discrete surface water samples from Niskin bottles and examining IFCB imagery. I'm showing here two of the large phytoplankton groups that I'll talk about today, dinoflagellates and diatoms. We also took samples for HPLC pigment analysis in phytoplankton groups. And today, when I talk about those pigments, I'll be considering paradenin to be representative of dinoflagellates and fucoxanthin to be representative of diatoms, although those pigments are not always perfect biomarkers for either of these broad taxonomic groups. We also considered the environmental conditions while we were sampling, so we measured surface inorganic nutrient concentrations, photosynthetically active radiation at the ocean surface, or PAR, and surface water temperature. So first I'll discuss a bit the environmental context that we found during this cruise in terms of PAR, nutrients, and water temperature. There's a lot of really great satellite imagery of the Santa Barbara Channel in the days leading up to the fire. So this is on December 4th, the day before the fire ignited. And then the next day, once the fire had started on December 5th, we can see that there's this plume of ash and smoke coming right over where we were planning to sample in the middle of the Santa Barbara Channel. So our group was monitoring some of this imagery in the days leading up to the cruise to see how the distribution and the location of that plume of ash and smoke shifted with the changing winds. And sure enough, on different days, we saw really different distributions of that smoke and ash going over the channel, but it was often going over the ocean. So if this is what it looks like from a satellite image, what did it look like on the ground? This is an image that was in the newspaper in Santa Barbara that was taken looking out over downtown, so right over the Santa Barbara Channel. It might be difficult if you're not familiar with this view, but there's a pier going out into the ocean here, and this is all the Santa Barbara Channel ocean water right here, kind of blending right into a horizon. So incredibly smoky, ashy. Both the amount and the distribution of light that was getting through this smoke and ash was clearly really different than usual. However, once we got out into the channel, we were lucky enough to have a drone with us for part of our cruise, and we were able to take some of this imagery of what it looked like on the Sally ride while we were out in the middle of the Santa Barbara Channel. It doesn't look all that different from what you might normally expect on maybe a little bit of a hazy or cloudy day. But we did have some evidence that there was still heavy ash deposition on the ship while we were sampling. So this is a picture that one of the marine technicians on the Sally ride took while we were doing a night CTD cast. And he was able to write with his finger in the accumulated ash on the rail of the ship. Kind of like if you've grown up in a snowy place, you could write on a car or something else covered in snow. So there was pretty heavy ash deposition while we were out there. Which led us to believe that it was possible that that was still really impacting the distribution of light. However, when we look at the distribution of photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR, during the time that we were at sea, we don't see major variations either in the magnitude or in the distribution during the day of the light that was reaching the surface of the water. So that led us to believe that this maybe wasn't one of the largest things impacting the phytoplankton community. We next turned to look at water temperature, which was again in the surface ocean relatively invariant during our week of sampling and changed only within less than a degree range in the time that we were out there. Next, looking at the inorganic nutrient concentration, I'm showing the log 10 transformed concentration of a few different nutrients so that they can be on the same scale and easily compared. The exception of, again, some slight variations in the nitrate and nitrite distribution, pretty invariant in the surface ocean during the time that we were at sea. So we didn't see what we had hypothesized we might see, which was large variations in light distribution or nutrient availability that we could directly point to having a source from wildfire smoke or ash. But when we considered the phytoplankton community composition through this combination of IFCB imagery and HPLC pigments, we were still able to see some unique patterns over the course of the week. So I'm showing first a figure that's breaking the images we took from the IFCB down into two broad categories of phytoplankton and detritus. And if you're not familiar with looking at IFCB images, you might not have a great sense of what this looks like, just seeing a figure that breaks it down into two binary categories. So I'm showing here some example images from each of these categories as we broadly categorized them here. So we have a number of different really beautiful, diverse phytoplankton cells on the bottom of the slide, and those are the green bars here. And then the brown bars are representing detritus. And we know from our time at sea, we mixed a sample of dry ash from the wildfire that had been collected on land with some filtered seawater and ran it through the IFCB to see if we could look at what those wildfire ash particles looked like in the IFCB imagery. And we believe that we were seeing a lot of ash particles in the surface ocean, but unfortunately, I'm showing here a mix of this pure ash sample and some natural ocean detritus. And it's really difficult to pick out, especially with the naked eye or even with an automated classifier, the difference between that ash that's coming from the fire and other types of oceanic detritus. So we didn't try to differentiate ash from other detritus, we just generally categorized it as a detrital component. And you can see that some days during our sampling, it comprised more than 50% of the total particle volume that we were imaging in the IFCB. So let's zoom in a bit to these green bars. And now I'm breaking down just those green bars into the phytoplankton community composition in terms of really broad taxonomic categories, looking at diatoms, dinoflagellates, nano-sized phytoplankton, which here we categorized as cells that were less than microns and were often difficult to taxonomically identify from imagery, and then other, so any other phytoplankton cell. And some days diatoms and dinoflagellates were not the dominant groups, other days they really were, and particularly the dinoflagellates stuck out to us as dominating a large fraction of the total biovolume. So we dug a bit more into that particular group, and now I'm showing in some more specific taxonomic resolution the diatom community broken into centric and pennates in orange and yellow respectively, and then a few different dinoflagellate groups in green and blue. If we want to look specifically at the distribution of those dinoflagellate groups, I made here an example of the cells per milliliter where we can see that a couple of different dinoflagellate groups really stuck out during our time at sea. I'm also showing these Umbilicosphaera, which is a coccolithophore, which were kind of always present in a background level, but had very distinctive imagery. So we often were picking them out as we were manually classifying the images. But these two dinoflagellate species, Goniolax and Prorocentrum, zooming in on this example, on one of the nights of our sampling, when we see Goniolax at this real peak, while we were on the ship, we were able to see some bioluminescence as we sampled that night. And then we saw this massive increase in Goniolax cells in the IFCB imagery. The next morning, we saw streaks of reddish tinted foam on the surface ocean, which ultimately ended up being at the same time as this increase in Prorocentrum, and it persisted into the night when we see this increase in Prorocentrum cell abundance. So now we wanted to know how these results during December 2017 compared to the historical results in the Santa Barbara Channel in December. We compared 13 winter plumes and blooms cruises to the results from ACID. And while we haven't had an IFCB as part of plumes and blooms, we have had HPLC phytoplankton pigments measured for a long period of that time series. So the first thing that I'm showing here is a comparison in chlorophyll A concentration between those 13 winter plumes and blooms cruises and our acid cruise. And we didn't see a very different average chlorophyll concentration over our week of sampling than a typical December in the Santa Barbara Channel. However, the accessory pigment distributions were quite different in December 2017 during the fire than they had been in previous winters. So on the concentration of fucoxanthin, which here we're considering a biomarker pigment for diatoms, is typically much higher in the channel in a typical December from the plumes and blooms sampling, whereas the concentration of paradignin is typically much lower compared to what we measured on acid. And we also considered some inorganic nutrient concentrations. I'm showing here that nitrate was actually lower than average in a winter in the Santa Barbara Channel. On the acid cruise, the N to P ratio was much lower than we would expect, but the water temperature was significantly higher than anything that's usually been measured on plumes and blooms. So just some broad conclusions that we're able to draw from this work. We found that dinoflagellates were often the dominant phytoplankton group that we measured in the Santa Barbara Channel surface ocean during the Thomas Fire. While the measurements that we made on acid were able to characterize the phytoplankton community, they are insufficient to show a causal relationship between wildfire ash and smoke and phytoplankton community composition. So our week of sampling in the middle of this long fire that ultimately lasted for more than a month might not have been representative of the total impacts of a wildfire on the surface ocean phytoplankton community, but we were able to show that the phytoplankton community was really different than what we would expect in a typical winter in the Santa Barbara Channel. And interestingly, that presence or even dominance of dinoflagellates in the Santa Barbara Channel mirrors patterns that were found elsewhere along the central California coast in the winter of 2017 to 2018 in Monterey Bay and around San Luis Obispo. And so we were interested that a lot of those studies related the dinoflagellate presence and dominance to the ecological disturbance caused by warmer water temperatures, which we also found in the Santa Barbara Channel. So although that is not related to the wildfire, there was still a disturbance occurring compared to typical winters, and the phytoplankton community clearly responded. So since the Thomas Fire, there have been a lot more wildfires in California, and I'm sure everybody who's been following the news, especially if you're part of an international community, you know this isn't just a problem that's affecting the United States or even California particularly. It's a problem that also is affecting a lot of other countries and a lot of places that are near the ocean. So in December 2017, at the time, the Thomas Fire was the largest in California history, but between summer 2018 to summer 2020, there were 6 more wildfires that became each the largest, deadliest, and most destructive fires in California history. And the fires themselves were not the only things to cause damage to the surrounding human communities. Other impacts such as mudslides or terrible air quality, the smoke and ash, also are impacting human lives and human communities. So clearly wildfires are a really pernicious issue that we need to address that are affecting not just the ocean ecosystem, but also the human community. Thinking a bit about some of these implications and lessons learned generally and from our study specifically, we know that wildfires in California have only increased in size, frequency, and intensity since the Thomas Fire. And a combination of climate change and fire suppression has been shown to be leading to more and worsening wildfires and longer fire seasons. So while the work that we conducted on acid was limited in its time, space, and scope during the wildfire, it still provided some valuable insight into how the impacts of the fire may or may not have impacted things such as the surface ocean phytoplankton community. And while 1 week may not have been enough to describe the impacts of a month-long wildfire, time series observations were shown to be really key in the work that we did. We wouldn't have been able to have the insights that we had about December 2017 in the rest of the context of the Santa Barbara Channel without the lengthy plumes and blooms time series that was measuring similar variables as to the ones we were interested in over a long time period. And we all know that oceanographic research is very costly and time consuming, so we were lucky to have that time on board a major research vessel during an ecological disaster. But time series observations can either supplement in the case here or perhaps at times replace that type of emergency field work that may be more difficult to plan during a natural disaster. So we have so many people who supported this project. There are a lot of people to say thank you to, and I'm really, really grateful for all generosity and kindness that we were shown from a number of different resources, either for funding support or for scientific support, materials and supplies. I want to give a special thank you to Rafael Kudella's lab for the loan of the IFCB and generous support since then. But really everybody named here, and probably people I forgot as well, have helped so much. And then I'd like to just take any questions at this point. I'm highlighting here a couple of publications that are relevant to the work I talked about today. And you may have also noticed while I was talking that I've shown some really beautiful illustrations. They were done by one of 3 artists who was at sea with us during this project. And so I'm also highlighting a couple of the art products that came out of this, and I'd be happy to talk about that part of this project more with anybody offline, because it's something I feel really strongly about. That was a huge success of our project as well. Thank you for listening.
Great, excellent talk. Thank you so much, Sasha. So here we got a few questions from audience, and the first question from Stephanie Scholars, and she asked, what is the usual relationship between water temperature and phytoplankton community composition?
That's a great question. So in the Santa Barbara Channel, we expect to see in the wintertime, usually diatoms and picophytoplankton. So having dinoflagellates in the winter was really unusual. Dinoflagellates are usually kind of more of a summer to early fall, I think, occurrence in the Santa Barbara Channel. And again, we were grateful to be able to draw on a large body of previous work that's looked at the phytoplankton community over an annual cycle over a couple of years in the channel to know what was typical and if what we were seeing was not typical.
We have another question from Sigdem Kapan, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Is the higher water temperature due to excess heat from the fires?
You know, I don't think that it was in this case, because it was a phenomenon that extended up the Central Coast and kind of throughout the California coastal current. So it wasn't local to the Santa Barbara Channel. It extended up through, at least we know, kind of to the Monterey Bay area at this time. And so I don't think it was caused by the proximity to the fires, but good question.
So we got a third question from Santiago Gasso, and the question is, the ship was up there about 10 days after fire initiated. Do you think if coming a bit later, you would have seen something different? And the question asked, I wonder if it was a bit early to see an impact.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and definitely something that we also considered. So, right, we left port 10 days after the fire initiated, and we're sampling for a week in the middle, and then it ultimately burned for about 3 more weeks after we came back to port until it was fully contained. So I think what I saw during just our week of sampling was that the phytoplankton community composition was really dynamic in the surface ocean and changing on even, you know, as short timescales as what we were sampling. So I'm sure we would have seen different things if we had gone a little bit later. I'm also sure if we had a highly resolved IFCB time series, like there, you know, IFCBs that are on wharfs or in one place and they're sampling continuously. So if we had had that for the week before the fire, through the whole fire, and the weeks after the fires, we probably would have had a really good picture of how the phytoplankton community composition changed, the time scale on which it was or wasn't responding, and how it might have even been different from what we observed during this week.
I see a question from Iris Anderson. Hi, Sasha. Did you happen to measure dissolved organic nitrogen or ammonium? On the East Coast, we're suspicious that dissolved organic matter is playing a role in initiation of some blooms.
Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah, so we did measure inorganic nutrient concentration. Some people also looked specifically in our group at taking the ash that we collected on land and mixing it with filtered seawater and then looking at a nutrient analysis of what leached off of the dry ash. And we found that there was an increase in nutrient concentration if we added that dry ash to incubations. So Tanika Ladd, who's a member of our team, has led that work, and she presented it last year at the Ocean Sciences meeting. I think there's some information online. If you're interested in that, I would encourage you to seek that out or talk to maybe more with Tanika directly. But we definitely found that there was an impact of a very high concentration of ash. And I guess wonder if the concentration that was reaching the surface ocean in the middle of the Santa Barbara Channel compared to in an incubation experiment was sufficient to cause the increase in nutrients that we would expect might initiate a bloom or change a phytoplankton community. Because ultimately we found that nitrate was lower during our week of sampling than it typically has been in the Santa Barbara Channel in December. So that wasn't necessarily one of the things that we thought led to this change.
I see a few more questions, but unfortunately we have to move on. So I am going to put these questions in a document to Sasha so that she can follow up directly with those of you. There are so many great questions coming in. I can't keep on top. They're in the chat, they're in the Q&A. So I thank you all so much. So great questions.
Yeah, please feel free to email me directly too if you'd like. I'm happy to chat more offline.
Oh, and May just posted a link to Tonica Ladd's work, an EOS article. So I actually haven't seen that yet, so I'm excited to look that up.
That is exactly what I was referencing. Thank you, May. I appreciate it.
I am going to pass the speaker role to Matt and let Jinping introduce him.
Great. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Matthew Jones. Matt is now a senior research associate working at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research in the University of East Anglia. And he got his PhD from University of Exeter, spent sampling black carbon in South American rivers using machine learning to understand spatial variability. He went to do his first postdoc at the University of Swansea, went on to work on global scale analysis of black carbon production by wildfires. Then he joined UAE in 2019, and then he has become a core member of the team that leads to the global carbon budget. Then he continued his research into the role of fire in the global carbon cycle and feedbacks to climate change. And then under the pandemic, there's a lot of bad news, but then Matt does have the good news to share, a piece of good news, and he bought a house and during lockdown. And he's working a lot on his house, and he said he's spent a lot of time covered by paint. So I hope you have your clothes clean. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jinping. Yeah, paint and getting to grip with a lot of different power tools. It's been quite fun. Yeah, so thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the introduction, Jinping. It's great to follow a great talk from Sasha. I really love hearing talks like this. Reminds me of all the fun I had on field work in Brazil during my PhD. These days I'm a bit more desk-based, and much of my work's focused on collating information from field studies, meta-analysing it and scaling it up to try to derive some interesting global insights. So today I'm going to talk about some of the insights from my recent work into the impacts of fire on terrestrial and oceanic carbon storage. In reality, this talk might perhaps have been called An Impact of Fire on Terrestrial and Oceanic Carbon Storage, because I'm only really going to focus on the global scale production and dynamics of pyrogenic carbon, which is just one impact or one aspect of fire in the carbon cycle. Of course, fire has many influences on the carbon cycle. I'm not going to try and cover all of them in a 20-minute talk. So just for a quick look at the agenda, I'm going to first talk about some of the basic core principles of fire's role in the carbon cycle. I'll then discuss how new understanding of pyrogenic carbon production should affect estimates of fire emissions and our understanding of fire's role in the carbon cycle. And finally, I'll talk about how this pyrogenic carbon is disproportionately exported to the global oceans and stored there. So this diagram shows a typical disturbance recovery cycle that's driven by fire. We have a fire event burning through a forest, stripping it of carbon and emitting CO2 to the atmosphere. After the fire, the vegetation recovers towards its pre-fire state, recapturing the carbon lost during the fire. In forests, these disturbance recovery cycles might operate on periods of decades to centuries. In other systems like grasslands, the cycle could be much faster, with fires happening every year in some places. And fire is just one driver of carbon turnover in these landscapes. Globally, fires emit about 2.2 petagrams of carbon per year to the atmosphere. The majority of that, 1.8 petagrams of carbon, is emitted from non-deforestation fires and non-peat fires. And as a general rule of thumb, these fires are treated as net zero events in the long run, as we expect the majority of stocks to recover from the disturbance. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's for another talk. Meanwhile, around 0.4 petagrams of carbon is emitted from deforestation and peat fires, and these result in a net loss of carbon to the atmosphere, since the cleared land is used for other purposes that store less carbon. So as plant matter burns, most of the carbon locked within it is emitted as CO2 and other gases. Global models of the terrestrial carbon cycle tend to represent these emissions, which are then able to contribute to the atmospheric stock of greenhouse gases and affect the climate in a coupled climate model setup. Although most of the carbon affected by fire is emitted as gases, some is also emitted in the form of aerosols in smoke. This can be included in carbon cycle models as well and further influence climate in climate models. However, meanwhile, the production of charcoal and other carbon-rich products of fire is not typically included in terrestrial carbon cycle models. These byproducts are formed through incomplete combustion under high heat and low oxygen. They are left behind on the ground after the fire, and they're often termed pyrogenic carbon. Pyrogenic carbon has some unique special properties that make it an important aspect of the global carbon cycle. So incomplete combustion of the organic matter in vegetation causes the dehydration and condensation of organic matter, and the carbon atoms reorganize and form strong bonds with one another. As temperatures rise, these atoms organize into aromatic ring structures, and those structures can further organize into chains or clusters. And the resulting compounds are a very stable form of carbon that degrades extremely slowly in the environment relative to the vegetation organic matter from which they derive. So the most condensed and stable forms of pyrogenic carbon are often known as black carbon, and black carbon is generally produced in substantial quantities at temperatures over 400 degrees Celsius. In this figure, I'm just trying to visually depict the significance of pyrogenic carbon production for the terrestrial turnover of carbon. Essentially, each time that a fire occurs in this disturbance recovery regime, a non-trivial amount of carbon that was stored in the vegetation is kind of extracted from the years to decades to centuries cycle and placed into a slower cycle of pyrogenic carbon, which is turning over on periods of centuries to millennia. In recent years, my work has focused on the global production and subsequent dynamics of pyrogenic carbon, and in particular, the black carbon fraction. So in 2019, I led a study of global black carbon production, where we adapted the GFED CASA model to understand how or to quantify the global scale production of pyrogenic carbon. So GFED CASA includes fire emissions that are driven by satellite detections of fire. And we collated a global data set of pyrogenic carbon production factors based on field studies. We analysed their distribution in woody and non-woody fuel classes, and then we applied those factors to emissions estimates in the GFED model to quantify global production of pyrogenic carbon. And our estimate was that fires produce 260 teragrams of pyrogenic carbon per year, which equates to about 12% of global fire emissions. So it's certainly a non-trivial fraction of the total carbon affected by fire. This work showed that with each fire, there is a miscalculation of the carbon balance. So this carbon would otherwise be treated, or is otherwise treated in models, as being emitted rather than as trapped in this form of pyrogenic carbon. So really what our study was showing is that around 12% fire affected carbon is actually treated or mistreated in this way. And we later estimated with notable uncertainty that the global scale production of the most stable black carbon is on the order of 130 teragrams per year. The global distribution of pyrogenic carbon production tends to follow the global distribution of fire. So fire is most regular in the global savannas, and that's why so much of the global pyrogenic carbon production is centered in the tropics. However, a greater fraction of the carbon in woody fuels is converted to pyrogenic carbon by fire than in the case of finer herbaceous fuels such as grasses. So for this reason, wildfires and deforestation fires occurring in the world's forests produce the most pyrogenic carbon per unit of carbon emitted. The question I'm interested in is simply what happens to the pyrogenic carbon after it's produced. Statistical models of the global soil carbon stocks indicate that soils hold around 200 petagrams of pyrogenic carbon globally, and that's about 14% of the total organic carbon held in soils. So this really gets me thinking about the ultimate fate of the pyrogenic carbon in the Earth system, what fraction is ultimately degrades in soils, and what fraction makes it to the ocean through rivers. And this is a critical question because black carbon turns over even more slowly in the oceans than it does in soils. Radiocarbon dating methods have indicated that oceanic black carbon is typically millennia to tens of millennia old, and much older than the co-located bulk organic carbon. And I'm just returning to this figure again simply to illustrate the important role that rivers play in the global cycle of pyrogenic carbon. So they transport a considerable amount of the pyrogenic carbon to a place where it cycles even more slowly than on land. Rivers essentially help to lock up pyrogenic carbon in the ocean pools, and this is pyrogenic carbon that's been produced by historical fires and stored for some time in soils on land. Rivers is, and really what this leads to as a big question is how much are rivers actually exporting to the global oceans. And I've been involved in some recent work that helps to quantify the scale of this riverine export. So my colleague Alicia Coppola led a study of particulate export by rivers. They found a nice consistency with a bit of spread, of course, in the black carbon content of sediments across a series of large global river basins. They scaled up their findings to show that rivers export about 25 teragrams of particulate black carbon per year, and that's about 16% of the total particulate organic carbon flux through rivers. And then last year, I led a global meta-analysis of about 400 measurements from global rivers of dissolved carbon in river water masses. And we found some really interesting findings, well, really interesting patterns. So rivers draining savannas and peatlands were about twice richer in black carbon than any other channel types. And rivers draining extratropical forests, grasslands and glaciers were relatively poor in black carbon. We scaled the latitudinal patterns of black carbon concentration to the global scale, and that allowed us to estimate how much dissolved black carbon is exported by rivers, which amounts to 18 teragrams of pyrogenic carbon per year globally, or about 12% of the total dissolved organic carbon that's exported by rivers. So based on the information I've presented here and from elsewhere, we built up a global picture of how the pyrogenic carbon cycle is, how it kind of looks when it's inset within the carbon cycle more generally. for a bit more info on this figure, I would invite you to check out the paper because it is quite complex. But the take-home message really is that following the production of black carbon becomes a major component of soil, and then it's conserved across the land to ocean aquatic continuum, and eventually stored very efficiently in oceanic pools. So for this reason, oceans do store large quantities of fire-derived carbon, which is kind of surprising in itself. And what our work on the riverine export of black carbon has shown is that around a third of all black carbon produced by fires eventually makes it to the ocean. So it has an oceanic fate. And for comparison, less than 1% of the carbon sequestered annually by land plants has this oceanic fate. And this leads us to conclude that fires are actually priming terrestrial organic carbon, and more specifically, vegetation organic carbon, for export to the global oceans. And these results really help to explain some of the observations made around a decade ago. And these were showing that around 2% of the oceanic dissolved organic carbon bears the thermal signature of black carbon. And this is really surprising when you think about the distinction between fires happening on land and the storage of carbon in the ocean, where fire isn't a thing. So what does all this mean from the perspective of climate change and its impacts on the carbon cycle? The jury is kind of still out because models aren't including these processes, by that I mean the processes of pyrogenic carbon production and of export to the oceans. However, in a changing climate marked by greater frequency of fire-prone weather, large forest fires like the ones we've seen in recent years are set to become increasingly frequent, and hence we can expect an increase in pyrogenic carbon production, an increase in the amount of pyrogenic carbon entering soils, and eventually through rivers reaching the global oceans. And increases in these carbon fluxes represent a negative feedback to climate change because they lock up extra carbon as the climate warms. It's critical that climate models, that carbon cycle models, including these processes, as pyrogenic carbon represents a major product of fire, a major constituent of terrestrial soil stocks, of riverine fluxes of carbon, and of oceanic pools of carbon. So this brings me to the three messages that I'd really like to drive home today. So first of all, pyrogenic carbon is a major product of fire. It's stored for long periods in soils, and it's disproportionately exported to the oceans and stored there. Second, pyrogenic carbon production and dynamics are missing from models, and so they could be missing important fire-driven feedbacks to climate change. And finally, we need to introduce pyrogenic carbon production to models if we really want to understand the full range of effects of fire on the carbon cycle, especially in the context of a changing climate. And watch this space because things are happening in that area. So with that, I'll wrap up and thank you all for listening and welcome any questions.
It's a great, fascinating talk, Matt. Thank you so much. So we've got the first question from Signan K-Pen, and the question is, if we could capture the pyrogenic carbon, could it be used as a soil amendment like biochar?
Yes, so I mean, my research has focused on, I suppose, the large-scale, some natural, some human-influenced fires that are causing this pyrogenic carbon to accumulate. But this process, there's discussion about the use of this process or manipulating this process to actually store carbon as biochar, place it into soils, and feel the long-term benefits of this in a kind of amplified way. It's something that the IPCC are considering, and working group 3, I believe, are focusing on that as one of the possible mitigation options for addressing the issue of climate change. I'm not an expert in biochar, but I would recommend that you check out the IPCC's Climate Change and Land report.
We have a question from Santiago Gasso. Is there any geologic record with a high biomass burning period over millennia or centuries in time? I wonder if this type of export can be investigated with past records like in ice cores or ocean sediments.
Yes, there's a great data set that Jennifer Marlon, I believe, compiled, which looks at is a global charcoal database. So this is really useful in terms of looking at long-term trends in pyrogenic carbon production and its kind of passage through river systems. A lot of the sampling sites are in kind of areas where sediment accumulates and is in relatively kind of low oxic conditions, and because of that, you can kind of see how it's been accumulating through time. So yeah, Jennifer Marlon has been compiling a database. I believe it's called the Global Charcoal Database, which is what it says on the tin.
Great. I don't have a question. Sorry, go on, Heather.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is kind of a layman's question. So from your studies, it seems like there's a lot of black carbon exported by the rivers to the ocean. And then the question is, in the ocean waters, is all the black carbon coming from terrestrial sources, or in the deep ocean there's hydrothermal systems, even though dissolved carbon is supposed to be removed, but then that any possibility carbon can be altered and then sit there in the ocean water?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and I suppose maybe something that I didn't have time to integrate into this kind of high level talk, I'd say, is that there is this kind of debate within the oceanic studies of black carbon as to whether all of the black carbon in the oceans is derived from terrestrial sources. So just to also note here that there's a second kind of terrestrial source, I suppose, of carbon, of black carbon, which is the combustion of fossil fuels, which releases soot into the atmosphere. Around 12 teragrams of black carbon per year reaches the ocean through that route as well. The third route, which you alluded to, Ximping, is that or a proposed mechanism for black carbon production in the ocean is hydrothermal vents, which certainly achieve the temperatures required to produce black carbon, and it's certainly something that is considered a potential source. I think the jury is still out to some extent on that, but it is an active area of research, certainly.
Great, thank you.
Santiago and I were racing to find the global charcoal database, and he found it first, and it's in the chat.
Excellent.
Thank you for sharing that. Any other questions? We have one more minute before it's 2 o'clock, and we can let Matt go eat dinner because it's very late.
I need to cook it first, unfortunately.
Yeah. I'm not seeing any other questions. I will be sure to send remaining questions that we had for Sasha directly to her so that she can. Oh, hold on a second. I'm going to put this global charcoal database in here for everybody because not everybody can see it. All right. There we go. Now everyone should be able to see that. No problem. I want to thank our speakers who gave amazing talks and thank our co-hosts. and thank all of you for joining us. Like I said, we'll be coming back again at 1 p.m. Eastern in 2 weeks from today to have a talk on tropical storms. So we're hitting all of the extreme events as part of this series. So we look forward to seeing you then. And I really hope that I can see all of you at the NACP meeting coming up next month. There's information in the chat about that if you didn't see it. It's on our websites as well, so you should be able to find it there. I want to thank everybody and wish you well. We'll be seeing you again soon. Thank you.